17 and 24, Paul refers to the wild olive tree. In connection with this reference, he directly refers to his Gentile readers. The you, which we find in verses 17 and 24, you being a wild olive, again in verse 24, you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree. This you is a direct reference to his Gentile readers. Look at verse 13. But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. The wild olive tree is simply a reference to the uncovenanted Gentile nations who never had, as Gentile nations, a covenant relationship with God in the Old Testament. But then there is this whole matter, this development of what Paul calls the cutting off or cutting out of the original branches. And so we must consider the meaning of the cutting off of the original branches. Paul also develops the Old Testament imagery by referring to the cutting or breaking off of the original or natural branches. Now this clearly refers to the removal of Jews who had been circumcised into the Old Covenant from membership in the visible people of God, symbolized by the one olive tree. When they are broken off, these original natural branches, these unconverted and unregenerate Jews, when they are broken off, they lose any claim to the promises and covenants made with Israel. The dreadful consequence of this cutting off is suggested by Paul's language, where he speaks in verses 20 to 22 of the legitimacy of fear because of God's severity in not sparing the natural branches, and the fear of God's severity in not sparing the natural branches, the fear that should inspire. Look at verses 20 to 22. Quite right then, they were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Behold then the kindness and severity of God to those who fell, severity. But to you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness, otherwise you also will be cut off. So, there is fear of God's severity in not sparing the natural branches. But then there is the grafting in of the wild branches, and we must ask the meaning of that. Quite parallel to this, but by way of contrast, Paul speaks of the grafting in of the wild branches from the wild olive tree. This grafting in means that Gentile believers now possess all the blessings which God's covenants with Israel embodied. They now participate in the glorious spiritual sap flowing from the rich root to the one olive tree. They are grafted in, and they now are brought nigh, as Ephesians 2:12 teaches us, to Christ, the commonwealth of Israel, the covenants of promise, to hope, and to God in the world. This is what the grafting in of the wild branches signifies. The covenanting of God, the bringing of Gentile believers into the one covenant people, the one ancient covenant people of God. But there is a fourth thing that Paul introduces here by way of development. And it is the meaning, and we must ask the meaning, of the possible cutting off of the new wild branches. The wild branches have been grafted in, therefore no longer wild in one sense. But now Paul warns the Gentile believers against a self-confident arrogance which might bring upon them the same judgment that came upon the Jews who did not receive their Messiah. He came unto his own, and his own did not receive him, and they were cut off. And now Paul says the same might happen to these branches from the wild olive tree that are grafted in if they are guilty of self-confident arrogance. This self-confident arrogance is the opposite, says Paul, of faith. Such a self-confidence will destroy their part in the people of God just as surely as it destroyed the part that the natural branches had in the people of God, just as surely as it destroyed the covenant status of unbelieving Israel. Conceit and arrogance, Paul teaches, are the destroyers of faith, and will, by destroying the faith of these Gentiles, destroy their part in the covenant promises of God. That lack of faith, that self-confident arrogance which will destroy faith, will lead to their being cut off from the one olive tree of God's covenant people, and cut off from the blessings and salvation that connection with the cultivated olive tree gives them. I think that's the meaning of the possible cutting off of the new wild branches. And fifthly and finally, by way of Paul's development of the Old Testament imagery, we come to the meaning of the possible regrafting in of the original branches. Because Paul does something else now. He tells the Gentiles to keep them in their place, to help them understand how wrong, how wicked, how foolish, how self-destructive overconfidence could be for them. He now tells them that God is able to graft back in the original branches that were broken off. Paul contemplates the possibility that dead Jewish branches which have been broken off may in God's incredible mercy also be grafted back in. I think this is what he has in mind in the previous verses when he talks about life from the dead. You break off a branch, it's dead. And usually, once it dies, you can't graft it back in. But in God's incredible power and kindness, it is possible that a dead branch can be grafted back into God's olive tree and enjoy a new and living connection with God through their being grafted back into the one olive tree. So Paul contemplates the possibility that dead Jewish branches which have been broken off may, in God's incredible mercy, be grafted back in. Now, some have taken this as confirming their hope for a future mass conversion of ethnic Israel. Now, whatever one thinks of that possibility in light of the rest of the passage, Paul's language here does not support that hope. His language is conditional. If they do not continue in their unbelief, they will be grafted in. That's conditional language. He does not say they will not continue in their unbelief. He does not say even that the mass of them will not continue in their unbelief. He only says his language is conditional. If they do not continue in their unbelief, they will be grafted in. Furthermore, his language is satisfied by a conversion of the remnant of Jews and need not suggest a future mass conversion. He's not talking about mass conversion here. He's talking about individual branches renewing their faith in God's Messiah, understanding that that Messiah is Jesus the Christ, and so being grafted back into God's one cultivated olive tree. In fact, look at verse 14, because it is similar to what I'm saying. Verse 14 is talking about the conversion of a remnant of the Jews, and it is conditional. So if somehow, Paul says, if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. We see the language speaks of a remnant, and the language is conditional. Well, that's the exposition of the passage. The Old Testament analogy and Paul's New Testament development of that analogy, the wild olive tree that he introduces, the cutting off of the original branches that he speaks of, the grafting in of the wild branches, the possible cutting off of the new wild branches, the possible regrafting in of the original branches, and all of that now brings us to some closing lessons. Some closing lessons.